The moment you drive that new synthesizer off the Sweetwater parking lot, the resale value has already gone down. Vintage synthesizers, like vintage cars on the other hand, actually go up in value over time. Not only that, but there's a certain magic feeling you get when you interact with a real piece of history. I don't know if it's the warm analog filters of the 70s or 80s, or the grainy, gritty wavetables of the 80s and 90s. There's just something special to vintage synthesizers. Whether you're a musician or a producer in a band, you might have Googled the price of a vintage Mini Moog or a CS80 and gotten some serious sticker shock. But today I'm going to give you my top 5 affordable vintage synthesizers with an emphasis on helping you purchase your first vintage synth. All of the synthesizers I'm about to mention are going to be cheaper than buying a brand new Sequential Take 5. The first category I want to address is the absolute best bang for your buck vintage synthesizer. This would be my pick, especially if you're a music producer and you want to get a cheap vintage synthesizer that gives you the instant sound of the 80s. My pick for best budget or value vintage synthesizer is the Kwai K1. And the most incredible thing about this synthesizer is that right now on Reverb you can get this synth for $300 with shipping. Here's how it sounds. What makes this synthesizer special is that it came out in a moment where Kawai was in a crisis. Roland had just come out with the D50 the year before, and Korg had just come out with the M1, both extremely powerful digital synthesizers that advanced what the Yamaha DX7 was doing, but in a more user-friendly way by using samples on top of virtual analog synthesis. Released in 1988, the Kawai K1 was called the Poor Man's D50, and the reason is because it has a very similar structure to the Roland D50 in that you've got 4 parcels that make up one patch. The reason I like the synthesizer so much is that unlike a D50, which sounds really high fidelity for the time, the K1 is instant, crunchy, digital goodness. There's such a charisma to the grainy, dirty, digital sounds of the late 80s, and it's one of those things where, in the context of a modern production, a lot of the times we actually want things to sound more retro than they did back then, and I think the Kawai K1 is perfect for that. It really captures the essence of that late 80s sound. For $300, you can get this incredible piece of synthesizer history from one of my favorite vintage synth brands, and I think it sounds great. Next up is the best bang for your buck or best value analog synth that you can get from the 80s. Somewhere around the time that Stranger Things released, all of a sudden the entire world fell in love with the sound of the analog synths of the 80s, and the Juno 106 shot up in popularity on Reverb and started going for prices of $2,500, $3,000. But there's always been another synthesizer that I personally would rather have than a Juno 106 that sounds incredible and you can get for only $400 on Reverb right now. Oh no, there's a basket of adorable ferrets that is lost in the tundra, surrounded by wolves, and the only way to save them is by subscribing to this channel, so please do that. All right, you saved them, right? Let's go. That synthesizer is the Roland Alpha Juno. Here's where it gets absolutely crazy. You can get a real vintage Roland analog Juno synth for $400 on Reverb right now. I'm using an Alpha Juno 2, but the two synthesizers are identical under the hood aside from velocity and aftertouch. Here is how the Alpha Juno sounds. The Alpha Juno, released in '85, is actually an update to the Juno 106 series of synthesizers, but the reason it sells for so much less is because it doesn't have the one fader per function programmability of the Juno 106. You can still totally program it using the Alpha dial, but it's not quite as easy. But I think for a lot of beginners breaking into the vintage synthesizer market, this is the perfect synth to get because it's completely analog and sounds absolutely phenomenal. And you don't always need to do a whole lot of programming. The presets on the Alpha Juno are really good, and if you want to tweak something, it's as easy as just entering the parameter and twisting the dial. So it's actually not that bad of a choice, even if you are a big synth tweaker. And of course you can hook it up to your computer and program it, or use your iPad or whatever you have and use something like a controller panel and program it there, and that's a very cheap way to make your own sounds with something like the Alpha Juno. The Alpha Juno actually has a lot of features the Juno 106 doesn't have, like pulse width modulation on the sawtooth wave, as well as different sub shapes and all sorts of really cool stuff. The Alpha Juno 2, released in the same year, has more keys on it, as well as aftertouch and velocity, but the original Juno 106 didn't have that. So if you're going after that sort of classic warm 80s DCO analog sound, I think the Alpha Juno is actually the superior choice, and it costs about the fifth of a Juno 106, making it the best way you could spend $400 on a vintage analog synth without a doubt. Next up, we have most flexible and easiest to program value affordable vintage synthesizer on this list, and this is a personal favorite of mine. I honestly think this is probably the most underrated vintage synthesizer of all time, and that is the Kawai K3. Right now on Reverb, I saw one for $600 with shipping, which I think is incredible. This is how my favorite affordable vintage synthesizer, the Kawai K3, sounds. The Kawai K3 was released in 1986, and although the outside of the synthesizer looks a lot like a Roland JX8P, internally it's a hybrid synth. That is, it has digital oscillators and an analog filter. And what's incredible about this analog filter is it's an SSM 2044, and that is the same filter used in the Prophet 5 and PPG Wave, as well as the Korg Poly 6. And so it is just the most famous analog poly filter of all time. And for some reason, I don't know why, vintage synth snobs have missed out on this incredible synthesizer, which is great for you because that means you can still buy it at a reasonable price. What makes this synthesizer so unique is that it has 32 additive-based waveforms to start with, which are much more flexible than just sawtooth, square, and triangle waves. And they allow you to make a lot of sounds that kind of sound like a DX7, but because it's running through an incredibly juicy, warm analog filter, it warms those sounds off and takes off the sort of digital brightness or sheen that can kind of be a little annoying and makes it sound super warm and musical. The reason I picked this one for easiest to program is because it's got a similar setup to other synths from the era, like the Alpha Juno or DW8000, but the difference is it has membrane panels, so you just press a button and then move the dial. Instead of having to type in individual parameter numbers and then adjusting the parameter, it's actually very fast. So although it's not one knob per function, I like to think of it as one membrane button per function, and it's a lot of fun to program. You don't need a programmer for it whatsoever. However, I did do a live stream showing how a free controller panel integrates in with a Kawai K3 and lets you do sound design with that, which really unlocks its most powerful feature, which is, in addition to the 32 waveforms it starts with, it also has additive synthesis oscillator, which allows you to use 32 harmonics in any way you want to create your own waveforms, which is incredibly powerful. A little difficult to do from the front panel, although possible, but the Kawai K3 controller panel is completely free. All you need is a MIDI cable running out of your audio interface, and you could use it. Next up, we have the best sounding affordable vintage synthesizer money can buy, and that is the Korg DW8000, released also in 1985. And you could get a DW8000 right now on Reverb for $600. So here's how the DW8000 sounds. The Korg DW8000 has an extremely similar architecture to the Kawai K3 in the sense that it has digital oscillators running through an analog filter and envelopes. But what is so great about the DW8000 is the filter. The first time I heard a resonanced pad with the DW8000, I understood what all the hype about vintage synthesizers is. I would argue that although the Korg Poly 6 is considered the golden era vintage analog synth from Korg, the DW8000 is the real dark horse because that is the superior filter. It's the best filter Korg ever made, in my opinion. It has such a unique character to it, and importantly, it passes a lot of low end. So a horrifying thing about a lot of analog synthesizers is the first time you crank that resonance up and you lose all the bass. It can be kind of heartbreaking because you wanted a squelchy bass sound, but you don't get that. You just get this terrible sounding tinny little no one's going to twerk to that bass line. The DW8000 is a synth about bass. This thing is so warm, so thick, so sometimes on the verge of being dark. It truly encompasses that 80s sound. It's actually darker than the Korg Poly 6. It sounds more analog in a way because of that. Now there is actually a cheaper version of this, the DW6000, which actually has an analog chorus. The chorus on the DW8000 is a digital delay / chorus. So sometimes you can get a DW6000 for even cheaper, but I opted to go with the DW8000 on this list because it's usually not that much more expensive than a 6000, and I think it's worth it for its velocity and aftertouch and for the 8 extra waveforms you get with it. And finally, I have the best one knob per function synthesizer if you want to get a vintage synthesizer for the knob twiddlers who really want to program their own sounds. This isn't just a really great one knob per function synthesizer. It's my favorite analog monosynth of all time, and that's the Formanta Polyvox. I saw a Polyvox on Reverb today for $1,200 with shipping, and this is how it sounds. Now, you might be surprised to hear this on the affordable list of vintage synthesizers because the Polyvox is one of those legendary analog synths that everybody covets. But right now, it's crazy. I don't know what's going on, but there's a bunch of Polyvox on the market, and they're much lower in price than they were a year or two ago, which still makes it $300 cheaper than buying a brand new sequential Take 5. And what's more than that, this is such an incredibly special synthesizer. It came out in 1982. It's actually not monophonic, it's duophonic. I misspoke earlier, but I like to think of it as a monosynth. It was made in the Soviet Union, the USSR, and it was very cool black knob-infested synthesizer that was sort of like a mini Moog, but a little bit like an ARP Odyssey as well, in the fact that it was duophonic. And then it's got some really special features like loopable ADSRs. And the number one thing about this synthesizer, though, and I tend to not be this way, I like talking about features more than sound because sound is so subjective. This synthesizer just sounds so good. Every time I turn it on, it like delivers that magic. The oscillators just sound great. And the thing is just like on a vintage mini Moog, as you turn those oscillators up past about 70%, they start to get a little distorted. And so it has this just powerful, edgy, just gooey quality to it that is amazing for bass lines, but it also does incredible leads. It just sounds awesome. When you crank the resonance on the filter, it really screams, so it can kind of do that acid thing without even needing any distortion. It's just the best sounding vintage synthesizer, I think, that is still affordable today. If you can afford $1,200 for a synthesizer, I think this is a no-brainer because these synths just sound incredible. But now, of course, you're going to have to learn what each of the Russian labeled knobs means, which can be kind of part of the fun. But aside from that, it is actually a very simple synthesizer to understand, but the power and the flexibility of it is surprising. It is an incredible piece of vintage hardware and just one of my favorite synthesizers of all time. So those are my top 5 affordable vintage synthesizers. I'd love to know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think I missed any synthesizers? And if you guys want to help the channel grow, the best way to do it is actually just to watch some of these videos. So on the screen is my synthesizer playlist, which covers all of my vintage synths as well as some new synthesizer stuff and effects and drum machines. So thank you very much. I'll see you in the next video.